Orientalism is a landmark text in post-colonial theory, written by the Palestinian academic Edward Said in 1978. Said describes Orientalism as the study of Eastern societies and cultures by the West. Said chose to focus his text on Islamic and Middle Eastern cultures. However, the theory applies to all Asian cultures. Said notes that the first Orientalists were amateur Westerners who were brought into contact with Eastern cultures due to colonialism, and they tended to focus more on things like learning Sanskrit or Arabic or understanding Hindu legal codes or Urdu poetry. However, due to the dramatic imbalance of power between Europeans and people from Asian societies, this study quickly became a means and a tactic of othering and exoticizing people from these nations. As European colonialism grew, Orientalism became an essential tool for colonizers to both understand and rule Asian countries, and ultimately served to degrade Asian people and cultures and justify the colonialism which was taking place. Orientalism didn't merely accompany colonialism, it served as a guidebook and as an intellectual justification for colonialism. Said traces the history of Western attitudes towards the Middle East in Western literature, and in the process he picks up on a number of harmful and unfounded stereotypes which the West invented about Oriental societies. In Western literature, Muslim men are depicted as moronic, treacherous, barbaric, and deceiving, as well as being unable to speak for themselves or needing Westerners to speak on their behalf. Oriental women are sexualized and depicted in disrespectful and inappropriate ways. Muslim politicians are depicted as despotic leaders who are overly cruel whilst also being addicted to their wealth and their material gain. And Asian societies in general are depicted as being exotic, static, backwards, resistant to change, and unwilling to progress into the modern world. And sadly, these tropes and stereotypes, which I just discussed previously, have also found their way into mainstream art history. Western culture as a whole is seeped in Orientalism. You can also find loads of examples of it in cinema, and I've just got one example here of Orientalism in Indiana Jones. I'm going to send you to a different screen. We can find loads of examples of Orientalism in Western cinema, and one really clear example is in Indiana Jones, in the scene where Indiana has to fight the man with the turban who has a Islamic appearance. The man with the turban pulls out the sword, Indiana Jones pulls out the gun, and Indiana wins easy peasy. Starting with appearances, the man in the turban is depicted in a very sinister way. He's wearing these all black robes and he laughs villainously and has a kind of sinister smile to him, whereas the light hits Indiana in a really flattering way. The man in the turban pulls out a sword, which is a more traditional and older choice of weapon, and this plays into the Orientalist trope that Islamic society is stuck in the past and can't break free of its own traditions, whereas Indiana Jones pulls out a gun, which becomes a symbol of Western logic and rationality and advanced technology. And of course, Indiana Jones easily defeats the swordsman, which demonstrates a sort of symbolic victory of the West over the East. And it's not just old movies. Tazzy Fee just dropped a great video exploring Orientalism in the new Dune film, and I recommend you watch it, but obviously don't click off my video, watch it after, you know the drill. And obviously there's loads of examples of Orientalism in classical Western painting. I just want to talk about two paintings in this video, the first one being Spirandone Roma's The East Offering Its Riches to Britain. In this painting, we encounter a kind of goddessy, light-skinned woman who almost looks angelic with the curtains flowing behind her, and she's got this kind of like Homer Simpson before he grabs donuts pose, and is receiving a string of pearls and jewels from another woman who is lower down and in the shade and of colour. This painting's supposed to represent the relationship between Britain and India. You can see that Britannia is being held up on a lion and Greek philosophers, whereas the lady who is supposed to be representing India is much lower down and in a position of almost like subservience or worship, being like, please take all the riches from my country. And what this painting is trying to suggest is that the relationship between Britain and India at the time was consensual and of benefit to Indians, and also that violence was not used in this relationship, that India wanted to give Britain her riches. This is obviously blatant propaganda for Western imperialism. You could say that this painting was made in the 18th century and that was a different time with different moral standards, and that it's not fair to judge this painting based on the morals of today, and that's fine, I get that. But the thing which I find quite shocking about this painting is that it's actually hung today in the British Foreign Office. And what that means is that when key policymakers are going to work or going to the toilet, I don't know, they walk past this painting. And I don't think that they take the time to stop and look at it and reflect on the very racist message that it's offering up. But I do think on some level, it tells us something about the mindset that the British Foreign Office has, that they choose to hang a painting like this in their office, or at the very least haven't chosen to take it down. And the last painting I wanted to talk about was Eugene Delacroix's The Death of Sardanapalus. In this painting, the Assyrian king is depicted moments before his kingdom is captured by an invading force. And rather than facing humiliating defeat, the king declares that he would like all his concubines, all his horses, and all his servants killed before he himself is killed. The king lies there looking pretty relaxed, pretty unbothered, as a bloodbath massacre takes place around him. There's literally a dead woman at the end of his bed and someone getting murdered on the other side of his bed, and he seems quite comfortable just chilling and watching. This painting indulges the Western fantasy that all Oriental leaders are despotic and cruel and materially excessive. And this fantasy is so useful to Orientalism because it validates white saviorism. It validates the idea that these Oriental cultures are unable to properly govern themselves, so us Europeans need to go in and we need to administer their country for them, and therefore validates any kind of colonial takeovers which you might want to justify as a European aristocrat. So it's all well and good finding loads of examples of Orientalism from 100 to 300 years ago and explaining why they were Orientalist, but how does Orientalism affect the art world today? Well, this is the part of the video I found the hardest to write. A lot of texts and books which I read on the subject have this kind of timeline where they introduce you to Orientalism in the sort of 1700s, and then they sort of conclude and finish off around the beginning of the 1900s. And that's pretty weird, right? Because it's not like Orientalism finished, like these intense power dynamics didn't go away. So why have so many articles and books chosen to stop at the 1900s? And I suppose the answer is that just like racism itself, Orientalism still exists, but it's much more subtle and harder to detect than it used to be, because those paintings before are very explicit. Just because it's not blatant doesn't mean it's not there. What I haven't been able to find, thank goodness, are any examples of contemporary art which explicitly use harmful stereotypes of non-white people or non-Western cultures. But that's setting the bar pretty low. Just because we're not using explicit racial tropes and stereotypes doesn't mean that we've undone the effects of hundreds of years of colonialism. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of how we choose to represent, depict, and platform non-Western artists and non-Western voices. And I think, unfortunately, the popularity of this meme testifies to that last point. It's also about how we confront our colonial and our Orientalist history. Are we willing to accept that a lot of Europe's most treasured and prized artworks were complicit in cultural imperialism? When researching this video, I came across an exhibition held at the Tate Britain in 2008 called The Lure of the East, British Orientalist Painting. And interestingly, they had saved a copy of the exhibition text, which accompanies the exhibition. You know, it's normally like printed on the wall. I'll leave a link to this text in my description box. But if I was to analyze the text, I would say that the Tate were going for quite an upbeat vibe in terms of how they want to present this exhibition and this show. The text goes on to say, "The exhibition will reveal the wealth of Orientalist painting which followed the arrival of steam travel in the 19th century." Note how they choose to accredit steam travel as the cause of all these Orientalist paintings, rather than mentioning the East India Company or the colonial projects which led Europeans to use steam travel quite so enthusiastically. But they don't really want to dwell on all those things because it's kind of a downer, and they're trying to have this nice exhibition and they're not trying to offend the Tate members. So steam travel, choo choo. You can tell that they're not keen on talking about Edward Said's Orientalism, but you can also tell that they kind of know they have to, because they mention it right at the end, and the text is 545 words, and they dedicate a solid 29 of those words to Orientalism. They write, "The exhibition will also inevitably engage with ongoing debates around the concept of Orientalism, the representation of the East in Western arts and literature, and its political contexts." They basically introduce and dismiss the topic as quickly as is possible. And I know I'm getting a bit detective here, but note how they use the term inevitably. The work will inevitably engage with ongoing debates around Orientalism. To me, what inevitably means is we're not actually going to do anything to engage with the topic of Orientalism. It's just inevitably going to be part of a discussion, and we're not going to get too involved. That's what it says to me. Anyway, maybe I'm reading too far into that. I don't know. So yeah, that's pretty much all they have to say about Orientalism. They don't go on to talk about how racial stereotypes and white supremacist power dynamics informed their collection or shaped the paintings in their collection. None of that, just that paragraph. And it's right at the end. So let's be honest, it's not actually a theme that the exhibition intends to deal with. It's a ugly footnote that they didn't want to include. So how can we fight Orientalism? What can we do to stop it from being such a powerful force in mainstream Western culture? Well, Said concludes his book in quite a depressing way. He says that the conditions which created Orientalism in the first place, and the huge global inequalities which led to this kind of misrepresentation of people from other parts of the world, still exists. But that doesn't mean that we can't challenge Orientalism when we see it. And to be fair to our generation, I think we are actually quite good at challenging misrepresentation when we see it. And that might have something to do with the fact that we have social media and we have Twitter and stuff like that. It could also be my bubble. Maybe it's just something I want to believe. But I think it's fair to say that Said's writing really did lay the foundation for the conversations that we're having today about how we can decolonize the art world and how non-white artists or non-Western cultures are represented in the art world and in culture in general. But even if we were to challenge every colonial and Orientalist viewpoint that we could find in the media and in the art world, Said grimly reminds us that the power structures still exist. A powerful series of political and ultimately ideological realities inform how scholarship works. What I read this to mean is that, yeah, we could be super on it. We could basically challenge every instance of racism or Orientalism that we ever come across in culture and the media. But if the power structure doesn't change, it's just going to keep producing misrepresentation, and it's going to keep creating harmful stereotypes and stuff like that. So I guess you have to take down the system. So how can we be sure that the forces which created Orientalism are not still in play in the art world? Well, obviously I don't have all the answers, but I'm just going to put out my opinion. So as Said mentioned, just because the power structure still exists does not mean that we should leave Orientalism unchallenged, and we should be challenging these things when we come across them. And I think that this feeds into a larger conversation that we're having at the moment about challenging racism and misrepresentation in the arts more generally. But what does that actually look like? This might mean challenging galleries and museums to provide more accurate information about their own history, their own funding, and how their collections were brought together. It might mean challenging films which use outdated racialized stereotypes. It might mean searching for less Western-centric art history books, or pressuring universities to offer less Eurocentric art history narratives, or even to make sure that they're employing a diverse set of lecturers. And I personally think that we should actually be making more of an effort to engage with the art, the literature, the films, and the music of non-Western cultures, because I think if Orientalism was designed as a tool to other people from different parts of the world, one thing that art is able to do is to be a tool to humanize people. And I think a good example of this is Korea. I think Korea is a country that most Westerners don't really know that much about. But because we've actually been consuming quite a lot of K-pop and Squid Games exploded in the West, all of a sudden people are kind of interested and kind of want to know a bit more about Korea and are excited about the cultural kind of things that happen there. And I think that's a really cool thing, the fact that we can actually look at a country that we don't know that well and be like, wow, this is amazing, this is so cool, I want to know more, I want to learn more about this culture. And in theory, we could get obsessed with a TV show or a musician or an artwork or a book from any part of the world, and I think it would be a really good thing to create solidarity between two cultures which don't have that much in common. So yeah, I think art and culture do have a really big role to play here, and I think that's really exciting. Yeah, so I just want to stress the point that I am by no means an expert on any non-Western art histories or on post-colonial theory. So with that in mind, I thought it would be a good way to end this video by just signposting a couple of resources which have helped me to make this video and have helped me to better understand these topics in general. Firstly, David Olusoga's book, The Cult of Progress, is a fascinating and highly readable book about how art history and colonialism are intertwined. It's refreshingly non-Western and just unbelievably readable, so I would definitely recommend reading this. I also really like the Instagram account, A Black History of Art. I think they do a great job highlighting black artists who have been overlooked by the traditional Western canon, and I'm always impressed by the amount of information that they include within every post, so you kind of learn everything through every post that they make. Alice Proctor's book, The Whole Picture, is a rigorous investigation into the colonial roots of our museums and galleries, and it offers a full analysis about how these institutions deny their own history in order to hold on to their collections and their prestige. And finally, I think that it's 100% worth engaging with Edward Said's Orientalism, not only because it's a great book, but also because so much post-colonial academia has been built off the back of his work. And I won't lie, it is quite dense, and a lot of the time I was a bit confused about what was being said. I couldn't follow it perfectly. It has really helped me to understand the relationship between power, academia, and colonialism. So, yep, big recommendation. And if you have any interesting non-Western or post-colonial art history resources, please let me know below, because I'd be really interested in reading them. I'm still learning too, so if you think I've misunderstood anything, please give me a heads up in the comments. I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much if you made it to the end.